Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It's Tuesday, February 23rd, the beginning of a new year, hopefully a better year than last year. We've gone through so many interesting issues. And as always, I like to have people on the show that bring us more issues to think about and to reflect on. And what could be more interesting than having a character who has moral issues to confront and decisions to make? And so it's my pleasure to introduce Judge Thomas Bishop, an old colleague in the law who is a judge, but now is a novelist. So welcome, Tom. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Sheila. It's good to be with you.
Okay. Great. It's great to see you. And so many days in the courtroom, and now it's interesting how we take on other interests. And you have a great interest in writing, I guess, and you've written a novel. So tell me, what does it feel like to be a novelist, to be called that, in addition to having the title judge, lawyer?
I would say it's somewhat daunting. I'm not sure that I really feel like a novelist, although I guess I am because I've written a novel. But it seems to me, I think of a novelist as someone who has written extensively and is viewed as a novelist. And since I've been a judge since 1994, I guess I think of myself more as a judge who's written a novel. But that's probably just semantics. I like the idea of being referred to as a novelist.
Okay. Well, we often talk about how sometimes first novels are about the lives that we know about, issues that we know about. Certainly in the courtroom, you dealt with families, with issues of child custody, child abuse, sexual assault. That was something you dealt with both as an attorney and then as a judge. And of course, the Catholic Church is something that you know about. So you combined a lot of those interests to write about the good priest. That's the name of your book. Why did you choose that topic?
I think I was raised Catholic, and I'm as appalled as anyone by the scourge of child sexual abuse by priests. And I've certainly read and seen what's been written about it. But I thought it might be interesting to look at the issue from the perspective of a good priest. How does a good priest deal with that? Because it must be very difficult for priests who are trying to carry out their vocations in the way they were taught to and in the way that really encouraged them to become priests. And so I think the most immediate reason is that I wanted to write something creative for quite a long time. And I wasn't sure what it was going to be. Initially, I wanted to write something that was set in Newfoundland because I'm charmed by Newfoundland. It's where my bishop grandparents were from. My grandfather, Patrick Bishop, was a Newfoundland fisherman who met his wife, Ann Bishop, who also was from Newfoundland, but they met in Boston, something called a Newfie Ball, which were dances that the Catholic Church put on for people from Newfoundland. And he came to shore after fishing and raised his family in Medford, Massachusetts. Some years ago now, my two brothers and I took my father back to Newfoundland, only his second time ever. And I was just enchanted by the place, its boldness, frankness, the warmth of its people. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to write a novel that's set there? I'm also a boat person. My wife and I have a lobster-style boat. And I go to Maine several summers. So I haven't the last few summers. Took it up to Lake Champlain one year. I like being on the water. I feel very much at ease being on the water. Probably explains why there's a chapter in the book about lobster fishing. But my wife, Catherine, suggested that maybe writing something set in Newfoundland would be a bridge too far for me, that I should probably write something that wouldn't require me to go to Newfoundland and study it, learn more about Newfoundland, but write something that may be more familiar to me. So as you saw, I read the book that it's set in a coastal community
Yeah.
in New England. So
Let me pull up let me pull up the book cover so you can describe the setting a little bit more. Okay.
sure,
So let's talk about it. So it's not Newfoundland, but it's just a New England coastal town. Is that right?
yeah, there's actually a funny story about the cover. Um, I had to hire a designer to do the book cover, and I employed a company called 99 Design, and I picked the designer just out of some samples of work that he had done. All I know is his name was Bob. I told Bob what I was doing and asked him to do a cover for me as a draft, and he sent it to me, and it was not at all what I wanted. So I rethought what I wanted, and I told him, well, let's do a New England a seashore, a coastal area, and I wanted a bench overlooking it. And we'll talk about the bench in a minute. And then I wanted, I want there to be a lobster boat or two, and I want it looking east toward the rising sun for reasons I explained to you. And so when I got back from him, it was something that looks like it might have been set in Greece. I didn't recognize anything about the shore, and the buildings on the shore looked European to me, and the boats were very strange looking to me. And so I told him I needed a lobster boat, and he basically asked me what a lobster boat looks like. And it turned out that I had, in my photo gallery, I had a photo of my own lobster boat called Cricket. I sent it to him, and so if you look closely at the cover, there's a boat down there in the water.
Uh-huh.
That's Cricket. So it's kind of fun for me to know that my boat made the cover. So you'd have to read the book to understand the bench, but I will tell you that the bench is, there are a couple of anchors in the book. When I say anchors, I mean not to drag you down, but to center you. So maybe centering effects. And the bench,
Right.
the bench is named after Father Pat's brother who died at sea, and it was built by a friend of Pat's and put on top of this hill. And during the book, when Pat is particularly troubled by something, he goes back to his hometown. In this book, it's called Duncan's Cove. He goes to that bench and he looks out on the water. The water brings a sense of peace for him.
Right.
It's meditative. He prays, he meditates, he thinks.
Right.
And it's a centering place for him. But I thought it would be good to put a youngster on the bench, which really doesn't happen in the book, but that's my license. Because the notion is this youngster sitting on the bench, Pat's bench, although it's named Sean's bench after Pat's brother, and he's looking out off in the distance at the rising sun, which metaphorically is really a new day arising for this youngster.
Yeah.
Better day.
That's interesting, Tom, because I looked at the cover and I was thinking, is this the priest as a young man, or what were you trying to convey there? Of course, is not giving away any secrets when I say that the book ends on the bench. We won't say how it ends, but the bench is a very important, in a way, character in the book, in that you're right. He goes there for contemplation, for deep thoughts and decision making sometimes, and most of the time alone, although sometimes with others. So the cover is very evocative of the book. There's no question about it. And you don't often get that in a book cover. So you've got almost the whole story in this cover, which is really terrific. But let's now talk about, I'm going to put this down for now. Let's talk about the setting in terms of time. It's not contemporary. You started in 1990, and this priest, Pat Keefe, is about 3 years old at that time. So he was born, he's a contemporary of ours in a way, isn't he? Can you tell me why you set it in that time frame? And as one of the benchmarks of his life, in 1963, he went to the March on Washington as a teenager, as a 14-year-old, and was very much impressed with that. And you use that kind of as a bookmark of the time frame. So discuss that.
Sure. Um, I didn't set out to pick a particular time, and actually, um, when I started developing Pat's character, I thought there could be good reason for him to be to go to the March on Washington, which, as you know, took place, as you just said, in 1963. Which, by the way, is the year I graduated from college. So Pat would be younger, by that many years than someone who just graduated from college, probably by 6 or 7 years or so. And so, one of the tricky things for me was that if I wanted Pat to go to the March on Washington while he was still in high school, before he went off to this sort of preparatory school, or junior seminary, they used to be called, then he needed to be around 15 or 16. And so that sort of created the time. And also I wanted Pat at the beginning of the book to have been out for a while, to have had a few experiences in different parishes, and then to have been a prison chaplain for a number of years. And so it all kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. That should be the timing of things. So and I actually had to do some charting of years to make sure I was being consistent with what was happening in the church, or when the whole child sexual abuse scandal began to become public.
That's what I was thinking about. Did the scandal begin in the 90s? Was it? That's 30 years ago now. I don't remember that, but maybe it did. The first cases started to come up in the 90s. Is that so?
Well, I think the big expose by the Boston newspaper, I believe, was in 1993 or two, in the early 1990s. There are some cases before that, but once the Boston expose was done, and you remember there was a movie that was done about that. What was it called? Torchlight.
It was I don't remember. It was a wonderful movie, beautifully done. I forget the name though. Beautifully done.
It was a very important movie, I think, because and that really opened a lot of eyes to what was going on. So early 1990s is when this really became, much more in the public eye of what had been going on for years. It turned out in the church, and also, without giving away too much about the book, there are some legal scenes in it. I wanted them to be sort of on the early edge of litigation. So that also made the setting there in the early 90s to be appropriate.
Let me ask you this. In your growing up, you said you grew up Catholic. In your growing up, or even as an adult, did you have any familiarity or acquaintanceship of priests? And did you know anything about some of the allegations that were being made against the priesthood and the church as you were growing up, or even as an adult? Do you have anything in your personal experience about any of this?
No, I think that's a very fair question. No, I was raised Catholic. I was actually an altar boy when I was a kid, and the priest in the parish were good people as far as I knew. And some of them I thought were stricter than they should have been, but I never had that any kind of issues with those priests at all. And then ditto in high school, which was also a Catholic school, and then I went on to Notre Dame. And at Notre Dame, there weren't very many priests there because you actually have to compete for your jobs there. If you're a priest with a PhD, you got to compete with someone else. You don't get the job just because you're a priest. But I met some wonderful men. There was a young guy down our hallway who was a brand new priest. His name was Father Ernest Bartel, and Ernie He just gotten his PhD in economics from Princeton, extremely bright guy. Another classmate was a fellow whose name was Ed Malloy. His nickname was actually Monk Malloy, and he actually went on to become a priest, and then later became the president of the University of Notre Dame, and for about 14 years. And Monk and I have stayed in touch over the years. He's actually read and written a nice review of the book. And I will tell you this sort of one personal experience that I had. It goes back, I guess, maybe around 10 years now. I was at Notre Dame for a reunion of a group I was part of with Monk Malloy as students. We went off to Latin America. About 7 of us went to Peru, and Monk and about the same number of people went to Mexico, each accompanied by a priest. Arnie Bartel with Monk's group and a different priest with ours. And we weren't there to proselytize. We weren't there trying to sell anything. The whole notion was just to live in this community, get to know the people in this community. We had about a 40% tubercular rate in our community. Probably half the people lived in homes with dirt floors and electricity. And it was quite an experience for me as a college junior. Anyway, fast forward, we're having this reunion, so many decades later. And I remember at breakfast sitting there and Monk Malloy and Bartel and another guy by the name of Don McNeil, all priests, all, my age or older. And McNeil had actually run a university associated with Notre Dame down in Santiago, Chile for several years. And I remember looking at them and thinking to myself, these are really wonderful men who could have done anything in life, but they chose to be priests. And what a burden it must be for them to have to sort of weather the scourge of child sexual abuse by their colleagues, by other priests. And so I was feeling, some concern for them about that. And I think part of that became my motivation to write a book from the perspective of a good priest. Hope that's not too personal, but that really does someone answer your question about why, there's after the book became public, after that article in the Hartford Tribune about it, actually a priest wrote a letter that was forwarded to me. It was really quite a nice letter, and I had a chat with him, and he sort of wanted to know why I didn't write about the bad priest. Well,
you did. You had a bad priest in the book. You did.
I did. I had several actually.
Right.
But this man wanted me to talk more about the typology of the priest who committed that sort of abuse, and that's something I don't feel competent to do at all. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I think I do know something about the effect that abuse has on kids. Unfortunately, having seen it in case after case after case, as a judge in the appellate court, because we see so many sexual abuse cases in the appellate court, they're all appeals from convictions. So I felt more comfortable talking about that than I ever would trying to talk about what causes men to commit that kind of abuse.
Right. Well, of course, you broached it somewhat in the book, talking about this particular young man's sexual experiences as a teenager and then more as an adult, and how he's able to set that aside to stay in the priesthood. You talk about the priests who are the bad priests, who are unable to keep their sexual needs away from the young boys that they abuse and victimize. So you do get into it. But that's not your goal. Your goal is to let the world know that there is a good priest out there who can reform the church and can reform the church and make priests do the right kind of service. Isn't that your goal? I mean, that's what I got out of that book.
No, I think that's more grandiose than my goal. I don't think of Pat as someone who's out to reform the church. I think he's a more straightforward man who simply wants to be a good priest, and he wants to do what good priests do, and that is to act in what would be viewed as.
Well, that's true. But in the end, he has a dilemma. In the end, we won't get into it. His dilemma in the end is what what form of his priesthood should he be doing? What type of service within the priest? And that's why I think you wanted him to do somewhat of some reform and changing the seminary life and the way priests are trained to give service to the community. At least that's what I took from the book, and what kind of good priest he was and how he needed to stay to do that. Um,
I think that's one of the fun things about writing a novel, is that it's really subject to interpretation by the reader.
sure,
You know, um, I have historically I've not been a creative writer. There's some lawyers who would probably say I have been in some of my opinions, but I've always wanted to try to be a creative writer. Uh, and part of it is what you just sort of talked about, is that the reader can read different things into it. Whether you read it into it because of who you are as a person, sort of who you want Father Pat to be as a person, kind of what you would like to see Father Pat do. One of the people who reviewed the book on Amazon said he was sort of disappointed in the choices that Father Pat did make at the end, for the reviewer's own reasons. That's sort of a fun part of it. I think there are storylines in the book that are open to interpretation, and I think that's fine. I think maybe that's a hallmark of a worthy book, is that different readers can get sort of different senses from the book.
well, did you write it to make us aware that there is redemption, that there can be good priests who can help rid the church of that scourge of sexual abuse of kids? Is
No,
that why did you write it, Ben?
no, I wrote it because I wanted to try to be a creative writer. I had no messianic view whatsoever of myself in writing that book. I really just wanted to see if I could create a story that came to life, and that would resonate with people and challenge people to think about issues. So obviously, I touched a lot of issues in the book, as you and I have discussed earlier. Death penalty, sexuality, um, sexual preference, the tug of celibacy versus.
But what brought to mind, because you know more about the church from your upbringing than I do, I was thinking as I'm reading it, how many good priests are there around? You don't answer that question. Is he a one-off? Is he unusual? Are there others like Father Keefe who can keep the Catholic Church going in service the way he does? I mean, that was the thought in my mind, and I don't know the answer to that question.
Well,
Um,
I think that's a question of a cynic. That's not an accusation, Sheila, but I would. My own hunch is that the good priests far, far, far outweigh the priests who have fallen, and who have been abusive to children in this way. And so, because I think the church would have collapsed under the weight. It certainly has shouldered a lot of weight with these priests, and it's been very costly to the church because of how the church dealt with this. But I don't have any sense at all, that the church is engulfed in child sexual abuse cases. But there certainly have been. We've all seen now, from what we've read and what we've been shown by the media,
yeah,
that there are a lot of
yeah. I think people understand, as you say, that most priests, like most everyone in all professions, are good. But the church had its systemic problems where many probably good priests didn't speak up in the way that the priest in your book did, you know?
Well, I think that's very fair, because, without giving away the book,
Right.
you saw there was one instance where Father Pat reached out to a colleague who he thought might help him try to change things kind of from the bottom up. And that backfired on him, and he found himself being confronted by the bishop because of that. So, yeah, I think it's very fair for you to sort of observe that so many people in the church hierarchy, and also colleagues of other priests, failed to report this and failed to protect children.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant by the good priest.
No question about
Yeah.
that. No question about that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the moral dilemma that he has. And in order to do that, I think we have to explain the issue of the confessional and confidentiality. As attorneys, we learn that we have certain rules of confidentiality, and a priest has certain rules when they're doing the confessional. So talk about that. What is that?
All right. Well, let me preface it by saying that I'm not a theologian and I'm not a canon lawyer, but I was raised Catholic and I know enough about that particular doctrine to talk about it. There are sacraments in the church, sacramental rites like marriage, and one of them is the sacrament of contrition. And the concept is that individual Catholics go to priests and confess their sins, and the priest is there really as an agent, God's agent, and bringing God's forgiveness. The priest isn't the one who forgives. The priest brings God's forgiveness to that sinner. The sinner needs to be repentant for the sinner to be absolved of his or her sins. And because it is sacramental, it's very valued by the church. The notion of there being an opportunity for people to come, confess their sins, be absolved of their sins, which in Catholic theory then permits them to then once again be part of the community, of the Catholic community. Not that minor discretions take them out of the community, but that probably gets too deep into the dogma. But it is part of canon law that the confessional is sacrosanct, and that a priest may not ever, under any circumstances, divulge to others what is confessed to him in the confessional. Now, a little bit like the attorney-client privilege, somebody comes into confession and says, Father, bless me, I have sinned, and I intend to go kill John Smith next week. The priest is not bound by the obligation of the confessional to keep silent about that. You can't go into a confessional and say you intend to do something in the future and get absolved of your sins. But you go to confession, confess something you've done in the past. Priest may not report that to anyone, and notwithstanding civil reporting laws, which is a difficult conflict in society. But that's how the church views sanctity of the confessional. So that's a dilemma that a priest could have. If I don't think it's given too much away to say in the book, as you saw, Sheila, that another priest does come to Father Pat, and confess to him that he has been abusing children. And what does Father Pat do with that? How does he handle that? And if he keeps silent, but fears this fellow is still abusing other children, then is Pat somehow implicit in harm to those other children? Yet he decides that he must report this, then he risked his priesthood. Not only his priesthood, but he risked his communion with
Right.
God. So it's a very, very difficult dilemma.
Right. He can only report it if he's learned that the person who's in the confessional is planning to do a crime again. Is that right? Or
Yes.
intense? How about intention? That he is it good enough that he senses an intention that the criminal conduct will continue? Is that good enough
No.
to disclose it? No, it has to be a definite intention, claim that I'm going to continue to do these acts. Is that right?
Yeah. Bear in mind, again, I'm not trying to pretend to be a canon lawyer.
Right.
My understanding of it is that the priest hearing the confession can't just sort of have a worry
Right.
that this person might do this again, that he doesn't really seem truly repentant. The priest can withhold absolution. He can withhold, actually,
Right.
absolution. But that may not be worth much, depending on.
Right.
Depending
So
on.
that's the thread that gets your character, Father Keefe, deep into working with families and kids who have been abused by priests, and his interactions with the hierarchy, with the bishop, and how he is scolded for being involved, and all of his back and forth, and that takes up a lot of the moral issues that he has all during the novel. Many instances of making decisions that he feels are going to help the situation, but not violate his oath.
Well, Father Pat is sort of a naive guy. He grows up in a pretty monochrome community around a bunch of other sort of Irish Catholic families, people with Irish backgrounds, and sort of drifts off into the seminary to become a priest, mostly because he thinks his family wants him to do that. And I think I talked about this in the book. He never imagined the notion of coming into conflict with the hierarchy of the church. That thought just never dawned on him, because he's not by nature a person who challenges authority, and so that adds to the dilemma for him, and I think in some ways adds to his humanity.
And we won't tell what happens, but that initial moral conflict has comes to an end. You have to read the book to find out what happens to that particular character in that situation. The other interesting thing is he's not just a priest, he's gotten a degree in social work. So your good priest has some sophistication in being able to deal with families and the young men who talk about the sexual abuse that they've had at the hands of other priests. And he has a facility with these people. They're comfortable with him. And he also talk about this. It's okay for him to go with them to see their lawyers, to go into court, to testify as well. You have him doing a lot of that too.
Yeah, well, a couple comments about that. I thought it was important for Father Pat to get a master's in social work, for him to be doing the things that he's doing, and that somebody without that kind of training might not have been as able to deal with the families and the children as Father Pat was. And somewhat of a stretch for me, but I think I've learned a lot over the years on this topic, either by seminars or just by the work that I've done. And so I wanted him to have that sort of extra qualification to enable him to carry on those conversations and to be as caring and reflective as he was dealing with those children. And then, yes, he does, we're telling the whole story here, but he does wind up helping these children, and he has this relationship with a local lawyer who is also a parishioner in the church that he went to as a kid. He's also from Duncans Cove, the same hometown. And so they're friends, and he does refer these kids to a lawyer, and also to the police. And then he does wind up helping the lawyer. And that's, maybe you might think of that as a little bit of creative license that Father Pat does that. So I'm not suggesting that that's a common route that a priest would do, but that's the one that Father Pat takes.
Okay.
And then, of course, testifying about, about the kids, and what he learned from the children, giving a little bit of evidence about sort of how some children react to this. Is a matter of his expertise that he has because of his background in education. And as you know, Sheila, an expert might be able to testify to in such cases.
Right.
There's
So we don't want to give away the book. So we want people to know that you've got to read the book to delve more deeply into the moral dilemma that the father has about the confessional and what he's heard. And you need to delve more deeply to find out what happens to some of the families that he is working with. You need to get more deeply into the book to find out his relationship with the hierarchy of the church and how that works out and what happens to him in the end. What does he do? What is the final decision he makes about his life and how he's going to go forward after being stuck right in the middle of all of these hot button issues of the day? So we don't want to give anything away, but it's fun to
we
go
haven't talked
through
about
all those issues. Yeah.
we haven't talked about the fact that he's a prison chaplain.
And he's a prison chaplain, and so that brings up so many other interesting issues too that you talk about: the death penalty that he observes in the prison, the question of recidivism and what to do about that, and programs that thinking about what things that you want to people to get out of that portion of his experiences as a prison chaplain.
Well, when I decided he was going to be a prison chaplain, it kind of came about naturally because when he was a young seminarian, he decided to volunteer at a local juvenile detention facility where he was assigned to work with this one kid to help him with mathematics. And they have a lot of banter back and forth. And the kid sort of challenges him about the notion of priests being celibate in a dialogue, which I think is kind of a fun dialogue between the kid and the priest. And then later on, during his studies before his ordination, he winds up volunteering at the state men's prison. And I took some liberties there in describing the prison. I've been to a number of prisons to judge. This wasn't intended to describe any of those prisons, but it's not such an unusual description. And then that sort of took me into talking about some of the prisoners he met there and what they were like. And what I was interested in talking about there was sort of notions of good and evil. Is there such a thing as evilness? Is there such a thing as evil people? Is evilness simply the absence of goodness? And so, those portions of the book that deal with the prisoners can take you as deeply as you want to go. Because, for example, one of my favorite parts of the book is when Pat is asked to meet with an inmate who has been condemned to death, and there hasn't been an execution in this particular state. It's an unnamed state, by the way. For decades, we have a new governor who decided to turn the switch back on, and this guy is the first one up. And Pat is sort of vehemently opposed to the death penalty, and he doesn't really know what his role is going to be. And that brings him back to his mentor. And in addition to the bench, the mentor is a person who Pat goes to from time to time when he's in a moral dilemma, when he's really feeling badly about something, or when he's just plain at sea.
Right.
Goes to him. You might remember that what that person's name is, Father Matthews. What Matthews talks to him about is what his job is working with this inmate. And he refers to Thomas Merton and also to Dorothy Day from the Catholic Worker Movement, basically telling him, your job is to go love this guy. And, don't worry about your opposition to the death penalty. He doesn't need to hear about that. That whole dialogue, I think, is a very meaningful dialogue. And it's one worth thinking about.
Yeah.
When I wrote that dialogue, I was very moved by it myself. It's a funny thing, Sheila, what happens, and maybe we can talk about this for a moment, that I found in writing a novel. And I guess I had expected this might happen because I've read books about creative writing. That once you start developing your characters in some ways take over, uh, and they kind of guide uh, the book, the direction of the book, where it goes. And so uh, some of where Pat goes, and I don't mean just on the surface, whether he's a prison chaplain,
Right.
but some of the things he thinks about are reflective of who he is as a person.
Yeah.
And, and so, what sort of counsel, what kind of guidance? When he got in trouble with the diocese, uh, his mentor talked to him about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. What does that have to do with it?
Right.
You'll have to read the book to know. But and I was trying to introduce some thoughtfulness there. So, from my perspective, this isn't kind of a story about a priest, but there are some reflections here about
Right.
what kind of a person you wanted to be. They show up sometimes in some of the
Right.
people dialogues.
Well, with all the issues in the prison, you have another whole book almost about prison life and the different issues. So interesting. It's not giving away too much to talk about how, as a social worker, he was able to start kind of a therapy group, a counseling group for men in the prison who were sexually abused as children, because in all of your research as a judge, as an attorney, how that abuse in your childhood can affect you and affect your criminality as you get older. So he does that, which is so interesting, as well as I think the wonderful dialogue between the prisoner who was sentenced to death and Father Keefe, and then the issue of the halfway house. What do you do when there is such a high incidence of recidivism, right? That was something that you talked about as well, and it was a very interesting part of the book.
And that came to me. I should tell you that I didn't have an outline of this book when I started. It's not as though I had it all outlined from start to end, just filled in the pages with dialogue or change to change to change. The book developed as I wrote it, and so at some point, thinking about him as a prison chaplain and what he was doing in prison, the thought just occurred to me that you probably ought to deal with adult survivors of child sexual abuse and what happens to them. Well, here they are; they're all in prison.
Yeah,
That's one thing that happens to them, and how dysfunctional their lives become. And Sheila, you and I both know this from the work that we've done, that that the incidence of the effects of child abuse on child can be life altering. Often is life altering. Sometimes, puts a kid into a downward spiral where it gets into drugs, suicidal ideation. Drugs can lead to criminality and spiral down and down and down. And so I thought it was worth talking about that a little bit and have him have this group deal with these people. And then that just kind of led me to what happens to them. And that might get into another topic you and I could talk about, and that is the topic of research, because I know there's recidivism. We all know that. I didn't really know how much there was. And when I saw how much there was, that sort of got me thinking about, well, maybe Pat wants to try to do something about that in his own little way, which then brought me back to his early work at parish with his friend, Father Jerome Robinson, the notion of creating a halfway house. So that's, from one perspective, you might say the book seems sort of meandering, but the way I think about it, there is a thread here. Think of this book as simply following Father Pat's journey through his vocation.
Right. So we're going to kind of wrap it up soon, but I wanted to emphasize again from the cover the ambience, the atmosphere that you set up in that seaside village. His family, his brother, a fisherman, Lost at Sea, the bench where he goes to contemplate, the very warm family he comes from, his interesting sisters, his interesting sister-in-law, and what happens to his own issues of sexuality himself as he grows up, and is he going to stay a priest? We're not going to give the answers to those, but I think those are all interesting parts of your novel that people should look forward to reading about when they take a look. So, having said that, I want you to give me a summary, your final words about. I do want to read this, Tom. I love Emily Dickinson, and you put her in the beginning of your book. You dedicated the book to all the children. And then you took from Emily Dickinson. I want you to talk about this in your final summary. We never know how high we are till we are called to rise. And then, if we are true to plan, our statures touch the skies. Our statures touch the skies. So give us a final summary with that poem.
Well, I thought that poem really addressed Pat's life and how he would carry out his vocation as a priest, and whether or not he would attain those aspirations. So I thought the poem was aspirational, and I loved it. So I thought it was a very appropriate way to sort of set the tone for the book that follows.
I think it's beautiful. I'm putting the cover on one more time. And any final thoughts for why people should take a look at your book?
No, I think we've talked a lot about it. It's available on Amazon or from Book Locker, which is the publisher, or directly from Book Locker. But people will buy it for their own reasons. I hope people will find it an interesting read. There've been a number of reviews on Amazon. People have different perspectives about why they think the book is valuable. I hope people find it to be a worthwhile read.
Okay, great. So I hope we didn't give too much away, that there's plenty for people to sink their teeth into when they read it. It's gotten great reviews, and you're even planning to write another one. You'll have to come back and tell us all about that. So it's been great having you, Tom. Everyone, again, the book is The Good Priest by Thomas Bishop. Is that it? Bishop, there you go. Great. And I love Newfoundland too. I was so interested in you talking about that because I assumed it wasn't New England Village, but Bay of Islands in Newfoundland, north of Corner Brook. I've been there. It is heaven on earth. Fabulous place. Wonderful. All right. Final goodbye, Tom.
Thank you for having me, Sheila.
Okay.
Very enjoyable.
Okay, great. Take care. See you next time on Talkback. Bye.